Well, with me here in the studio is Paulo Roberto Franca. He's Brazil's Consul General in Istanbul. In London, we have Professor Anthony Pereira. He's the director of the Brazil Institute at King's College London. And in Ljubljana is Drago Kos. He heads up the OECD's efforts to fight corruption and bribery. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Mr. Ambassador, let me begin with you. We have both Dilma Rousseff and Lula da Silva feeling as if there's a witch hunt against them and that the system is rigged against them. Is that accurate?
First of all, I'm very pleased and honored to be here again with you. No, it's not accurate. And I think that it's a piece of fiction, their version of the facts. There was a process of the impeachment that took place during 9 months. The ex-president had very many possibilities to show that she did not commit unlawful acts. And she was not able to do that. She was not able to convince during this process, very traumatic 9 months, that she didn't commit these unlawful acts. I think the same thing can be applied as far as the trial, and yesterday the decision which was taken by the appeal court as far as ex-President Lula is concerned. We as a state, myself as a state agent, in fact we have to respect the decisions of the court, and we have to follow that, as I said, take into account the respect that we have to have for the institutions in our country.
Okay, Anthony Pereira, have we seen justice being served with Lula da Silva's conviction being upheld, or are we seeing more of a situation where the Workers' Party is being unfairly targeted?
Well, I think it's, what you got in both the first instance with Sergio Moro and the second instance with the court in Porto Alegre is an interpretation of the facts. And jurists differ, just as members of the general public differ on whether that's just. I think the Consul General makes some very good points, but I think the reason why this conviction generates some disquiet, even amongst people who are not supporters of Lula and are not supporters of the Workers' Party, is that the institutions do not always work consistently. So the judiciary and the Congress have overlapping jurisdictions, they have battles, the law isn't always applied consistently, and there are real questions over why, in certain cases, some people are not treated in the same way as in other cases.
Okay, interesting point. So, Drago, let me then ask you, is the argument that they're all corrupt and when necessary, those in power or those who have a bit more power than the others can just cherry pick the corruption of the people they want to crush, and that's the problem in Brazil right now?
Well, you see, but this is the argument which is always used by the top officials when they are investigated or sentences for corruption. So the argument, I did it or I didn't do it or I should not be investigated because everybody else is doing it, is something which simply cannot fly. So the OECD, especially the Working Group on Bribery, we support the efforts of the Brazilian law enforcement agencies and judiciary. And we don't care so much who is under investigation, who will be prosecuted, who will be sentenced. What is important is that Brazil deals with its own corruption.
For the time being, Anthony Pereira, it's dividing Brazilian society. Is it worth it in the long run?
Oh, I think it's worth it to try to tackle corruption. I think there's no question that the majority of Brazilians and the majority of the observers abroad want to end systemic corruption. I think the problem is that you sometimes have inequality of treatment. So just to give an example, when Eduardo Cunha, who was then president of the lower house, was charged in the Supreme Court very aggressively asserted their authority, and he was stripped of his immunity, and he's in prison now, actually. When there's similar investigations on Aécio Neves, who was the presidential candidate in 2014, the Supreme Court deferred to Congress and said this is really an issue for Congress. There's a real debate about how well it's being done, and it goes beyond the partisan issue of PT and Lula.
Okay, so Paulo Franca, inequality of treatment and this idea that and justice for some. Is that a fair argument?
I don't think it's a fair argument because one of our colleagues in this program has just referred to the Anthony has just referred to the fact that Eduardo Cunha, he was the president of the Chamber of Deputies in Brazil, and he belonged to another party. So it's not rigged. There are a number of entrepreneurs, big entrepreneurs, that are in jail now because of corruption. I think that there is an effort in Brazil, and we have to welcome this effort, to clean up the country from this wrongdoing, from this type of crime. These crimes, in fact, have created a very difficult situation for the population.
Right.
Let me just mention a very simple example. The other day, the ex-governor of Rio, Sérgio Cabral, appeared handcuffed. And then people in Brazil, he should not have appeared handcuffed. And his mother defended him, saying that he was not a criminal. Then a physician in a hospital, humble physician, doctor in a hospital, said, no, I disagree with the mother. She didn't dealt with the question of being handcuffed or not, but she said, the problem that I face in this hospital every day, people dying, there are no medicines. All this money that was not directed towards the ends that they were supposed to go, towards hospitals, towards roads, towards infrastructure, towards education, was either in the hands of party or in the hands of some corrupt people. So this has to be dealt with in a way that everybody is treated equally and nobody is above the law.
Right. So, Drago, do you believe, from your analysis, looking at it from the outside in, that if it can be proven that, for example, President Temer is corrupt, he will also face the same consequences as Dilma Rousseff and Lula da Silva?
Well, what we would expect that the system would react against everybody in exactly the same way. We even have a special article in the OECD Convention against Foreign Bribery, which is Article 5, saying that, let's say, the identity of persons involved should not influence in any way the investigations, prosecutions, and the work of judges. I have to mention, though, that, let's say, in the last month, we see some developments in Brazil, which might mean that the conditions for the work of the law enforcers and judges are getting tougher. So the whole system of reaction towards corruption, it is becoming a bit more complicated. And we were expecting to see Brazil coming back to Paris in March, because they will have to tell us what is going on.
Right.
We still hope that the events, let's say, like appointment of the new Director General of the Federal Police, the appointment of the new General Prosecutor, very unfortunate pardon of the current president at the end of the previous year, they're just simply, let's say, mistakes. And we really hope that those are not red flags which will turn into some real impediments for the effective fight against corruption in Brazil for the future.
Yeah, those are interesting warning signs. Anthony Pereira, do you expect trouble between now and October the 7th?
Trouble, you mean in terms of more conflict over
on the
over
streets,
these issues?
with regards to the Workers' Party saying they will make the country ungovernable, with them continuing the fight and Lula still wanting to run for president?
Well, I think Lula and his team, they'll try to go as far as they can, appealing this and keeping him up, keeping as a candidate. But they'll probably, if he ends up exhausting his appeals, they'll probably try to choose another candidate. I think what's interesting is that there may be a debate in Brazil as a result of this pattern that I've been talking about. There may be some discussion of the privileged forum, because this is an institution in which there's about 700 people at the federal level, including President Michel Temer, who can only be judged in the Supreme Court. And that's a very problematic institution if you're talking about the rule of law and the law applying equally to everybody, because what that means is that the overload in the Supreme Court is so great that it's very hard for the Supreme Court to actually process all these cases. And in fact, many people who've been investigated in Congress, for example, in the ministries, are effectively able to escape punishment, or at least delay it for a very long time, because of the privileged forum. So I think you might get a debate about that in Brazil over the next year.
Oh, that's interesting. So, Ambassador Paulo Roberto França, would that be a crinkle in the justice system that is worth addressing?
I think that the question there is that we have to be fair, we have to be even, and we have to follow the rule that everybody is equal and nobody is above the law. That's something that has to be function as a rule. One thing that I wanted to say that it's very important. I've been to Brazil very recently, and there is a sense of betrayal in the Brazilian population. I took many taxi cabs and I talked to them about different issues. And of course, politics is the one that comes all the time. And they have this sense of, they believed in a process, they believed in a platform that began when Lula became president. And they have this feeling that they have been betrayed in this process. And nowadays, we have to deal with what has happened during these days. We have to deal as well with the fact that our economy has to catch up again. The period of President Dilma was disastrous in terms of management. Now, President Temer is putting the economy again on the tracks. We are beginning to grow, we are beginning to create jobs, and of course there is the question of justice. Of course there is. What we have to do is to leave the justice to follow its path.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see if there's going to be a battle between those who felt betrayed and those who feel there's a betrayal of their leadership, who they still love. For example, Lula and Dilma, and they feel have been treated unjustly. Fascinating times in Brazil. Gentlemen, I have to move on, so my apologies. Paulo Roberto França, Anthony Pereira, and Drago Kos, thank you very much for your input on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.